In episode 57, titled Weak Features and Insufficient Signal, When Better Modeling Won't Save You, the goal is to recognize low signal early so you do not waste time chasing complex models that cannot manufacture information that is not there. This is an uncomfortable lesson because it runs against the instinct to keep trying new algorithms until something works. But strong practitioners know when the limitation is the data rather than the technique. The exam cares because it tests whether you can diagnose why performance is poor and choose the next step that actually increases evidence rather than choosing a more sophisticated model as a reflex. In real systems, weak signal is common when outcomes are rare, labels are noisy, or the measured predictors are proxies for the true drivers. If you can identify weak signal honestly, you can pivot toward actions that improve the problem definition and the data, which is where real gains usually come from. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the DataX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Weak features are predictors with little relationship to the target, meaning they do not help distinguish cases with the outcome from cases without it in a stable, generalizable way. Weak does not mean useless in every context. It can mean the relationship is small relative to noise, inconsistent across segments, or only present under certain conditions. A feature can also appear weak if its effect is nonlinear or interaction-driven, and your summaries are too simple to detect it. But the core idea is that the feature provides little reliable information as currently represented. The exam often frames this through small improvements over baseline or through features that look plausible but fail to improve metrics, and your job is to interpret that as a signal about information content. Weak features are also common when data is collected for operational purposes rather than analytic purposes, because operational logs may not measure the causal drivers of the outcome. When you define weak features clearly, you are setting a boundary. Modeling can only extract what the data contains. A key symptom of weak signal is near-random performance across many model families where changing the algorithm changes the story but not the quality. You may see accuracy hovering near the naive baseline, ranking metrics barely above chance, or regression errors that do not improve meaningfully over simple averages. You may also see instability, where performance fluctuates widely across splits, suggesting that the model is fitting noise in one sample and failing in another. When linear models, tree-based models, and more flexible approaches all perform similarly poorly, that is a strong clue that the dataset does not contain predictive structure at the granularity you are attempting. The exam expects you to recognize that try a different model is not always the right answer, especially when multiple families have already been tried, or when the scenario implies low information inputs. A disciplined narration treats this as a diagnostic sign that the limiting factor is signal-to-noise ratio, not the choice of algorithm. Before concluding that features are weak, you should check label quality, because noisy targets can create the illusion of weak predictors even when meaningful structure exists. If the target labels are wrong, inconsistent, delayed, or based on imperfect heuristics, a model can struggle because it is trying to learn a mapping to an unstable outcome definition. Label noise can flatten real relationships, making strong predictors look weak by injecting contradictory training examples that confuse learning. In security contexts, labels can be particularly noisy because true incident status can depend on investigation capacity, reporting bias, or evolving definitions, which means the target is partly a measurement of process, not just reality. The exam often tests this by describing inconsistent labeling or uncertain ground truth. And the correct reasoning is that improving label reliability can unlock signal that modeling alone cannot reveal. When you audit label quality, you are testing whether the problem is no signal or signal hidden behind unreliable targets. You also need to review the data generating process, because weak signal can be a sign that you are measuring the wrong drivers or measuring the right drivers too indirectly. Many outcomes are driven by latent factors you do not observe directly, such as intent, adversary capability, process maturity, or environmental context, and your recorded variables may only weakly reflect those drivers. If your predictors are primarily administrative metadata, while the outcome is driven by behavioral patterns you do not capture, the model will struggle regardless of complexity. In addition, some predictors may be recorded after the outcome or may be influenced by the outcome, creating leakage or reverse causality that can confuse evaluation and interpretation. The exam expects you to reason about what the system actually measures and how that measurement relates to the outcome, because that reasoning determines whether the feature set is appropriate. When you examine the data generating process, you are asking whether the dataset is even capable of answering the question you are posing. If the drivers are not measured well, the most productive path is often to consider new features, new sources, or better labels rather than to consider a more complex model. New features might come from different telemetry, richer behavioral signals, or contextual attributes that capture exposure and opportunity, which often carry more predictive power than static metadata. New sources can include logs from additional systems, third-party signals, or human assessments, as long as they can be obtained consistently and ethically. Better labels can come from improved adjudication, clearer definitions, or sampled manual review that increases ground truth quality for a subset of data. The exam often frames this as collect more data or improve measurement, and the correct answer is to recognize that information content is created upstream of modeling. When you choose to enrich data, you are choosing to raise the ceiling on what any model can achieve. Baselines are essential because they tell you whether any model is truly adding value beyond simple heuristics, and they are an exam-relevant discipline. A baseline might be a naive classifier that predicts the majority class, a simple scorecard based on one or two obvious predictors, or a rule-based threshold that reflects current operational practice. If a complex model cannot beat a baseline reliably, that is evidence that either the signal is weak, the evaluation is flawed, or the model is not aligned to the objective. Baselines also help you communicate results because stakeholders can understand improvement relative to a simple reference better than they can understand a raw metric in isolation. The exam often tests whether you would deploy a sophisticated model without proving baseline improvement, and the correct posture is to demand evidence that the model outperforms simple approaches in the conditions it will face. When you use baselines, you turn poor performance into a structured diagnosis rather than a vague disappointment. Endless tuning is a common trap in weak signal problems because small fluctuations in validation metrics can be mistaken for progress when they are actually noise. If evaluation remains unstable and low despite changes in model type, hyperparameters, and feature variance, the most likely explanation is that the system is not learning stable structure. Overtuning in this context can also create a fragile model that looks better in development because it is indirectly tailored to the idiosyncrasies of a particular split or time window. The exam expects you to recognize when additional tuning is not justified by evidence and to pivot toward improving data, redefining the target, or reframing the goal. The practical habit is to set stopping rules. If multiple model families and reasonable feature sets fail to produce stable improvement beyond baseline, stop adding complexity and revisit the problem definition. When you avoid endless tuning, you preserve time and reduce the risk of deploying an overfit solution with weak real-world value. Segmentation can reveal hidden signal because some relationships exist only in subsets, and aggregating across heterogeneous populations can wash those relationships out. For example, predictive signal might be strong for one platform type but absent for another, or strong for high-value accounts but weak for low-value accounts, because behavior and exposure differ. When you segment, you are effectively asking whether the problem is truly one problem or several related problems with different drivers. The exam often hints at segmentation variables such as region, tier, device class, or business unit, and expects you to consider that a global model might be averaging away meaningful patterns. Segmentation also helps you set realistic expectations because you might decide to deploy a model only where it has signal rather than forcing it onto all populations. When you narrate segmentation as a remedy, you are acknowledging that weak signal can be an artifact of mixing groups with different mechanisms. Feature engineering can sometimes recover signal by capturing interactions and nonlinearity, but it must be done carefully to avoid turning weak signal into overfitted noise. If the true relationship depends on a threshold or a combination of conditions, a naive linear representation might miss it, making features look weak when the problem is actually representation mismatch. Creating interaction features, windowed counts, or transformed variables can make meaningful structure visible, especially when domain knowledge suggests a particular mechanism. The risk is that feature engineering can also explode the feature space and create many opportunities to fit chance patterns, which is especially dangerous when the underlying signal is genuinely low. The exam expects you to balance these forces by engineering features only when you have a clear hypothesis about the mechanism and by validating improvements on held-out data rather than trusting training gains. When you use engineering carefully, you are trying to represent real structure, not to brute force performance. Communicating limits honestly is part of professional competence because some problems are not predictable yet with available data, and pretending otherwise damages trust. If the signal is weak, you should describe what you tested, what baselines you compared against, and what the evidence suggests about current predictability. You should also describe what changes would likely increase signal, such as improved labels, additional telemetry, or refined targets, so the conversation stays constructive rather than fatalistic. The exam cares because it tests whether you can match claim strength to evidence, and overclaiming in a weak signal setting is a clear judgment error. Honest communication also protects operations because deploying a weak model can create false confidence, wasted effort, and decision harm that exceeds any small benefit. When you state limits clearly, you are setting realistic expectations and directing effort toward improvements that actually change the information available. At some point, you must choose the next action, and the best choice usually falls into collecting better data, redefining the target, or changing the goal. Collecting data is appropriate when the outcome is meaningful but undermeasured, and you can realistically gather new signals or improve coverage. Redefining the target is appropriate when the current label is noisy, ambiguous, or misaligned with the decision because a better target can reveal signal that was previously hidden. Changing the goal is appropriate when prediction is not feasible, but description, monitoring, or segmentation can still support useful decisions, such as prioritization based on risk factors rather than precise prediction. The exam often frames this as choosing an appropriate response to low performance, and the correct answer is usually upstream change rather than downstream complexity. When you choose the next action deliberately, you are treating analytics as an iterative measurement process, not as a one-shot modeling contest. A useful anchor memory is, if signal is absent, complexity only adds noise. This anchor reminds you that flexible models have more capacity to fit patterns, and when the data contains little true structure, that capacity will be spent fitting random variation. It also reminds you that time spent tuning in a low-signal regime is often time spent optimizing to the evaluation noise rather than improving real-world performance. The anchor does not mean you should never use complex models. It means you should earn complexity by demonstrating signal and stable improvement beyond baseline first. On the exam, this anchor helps you reject answers that escalate algorithm sophistication without addressing label quality, data coverage, or measurement alignment. When you apply it, you prioritize actions that increase information content, which is the only reliable way to raise performance ceilings. To conclude episode 57, identify one weak signal sign and one corrective step that addresses the likely root cause. A clear weak signal sign is that multiple model families produce performance close to baseline and that results vary widely across validation splits, indicating that any apparent improvement is fragile and likely driven by noise. A corrective step is to audit and improve label quality, because noisy targets can suppress real relationships and make predictors appear weak even when they are informative. You would then re-evaluate against simple baselines using a stable validation design to see whether signal emerges once the target is more reliable. If performance remains low after label improvements, you would pivot to collecting new features or reframing the goal rather than tuning endlessly. This is the exam-ready posture. Diagnose weak signal from consistent symptoms. Choose an upstream corrective action and validate whether the action increases real, stable evidence. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.